Right. Hello again, everyone, and welcome to the latest Axiomatics webinar. Today, our topic is a practical approach to GDPR requirements. This is such an important topic these days, and we're glad you've joined us so that we can share some of our perspectives with you. So as is usual with these webinars, here are a few guidelines. Your lines will be muted so that we can have good quality for the recording, which will be made available in the very near future. We will have time for Q&A at the end of the session, but of course always invite you to put your questions in the GoToWebinar question panel as you think of them, and we'll address them at the end of the session. Now for today's content, here are our speakers. My name is Gerry Gebel. I'll be hosting this session today. My good colleague Måns Håkansson will be doing the most of the presentation. Måns is from our customer relations team and based in our Stockholm office and has a lot of great experience and perspective on the topic today. We're also fortunate enough to be joined by Atul Ojha, who is a senior manager in the digital IAM cybersecurity team at EY. Unfortunately, his colleague Kaushal Patel is not able to join us today, but we're very happy to have Atul to give us some practical perspectives from the EY practice on how to deal with GDPR kinds of requirements. And before we get started with the content here, just a few notes about some upcoming events. It seems like November is a very busy time for us at Axiomatics here, participating in a number of industry events. In particular, the Gartner Identity Summit coming up later this month. So I hope that we'll see many of you there. If you have some time that you'd like to spend with us, please do reach out and we'd be happy to schedule some time with you. So what we'll do today, and talking about GDPR requirements that are coming up in a very short period of time now, we won't be focusing on ABAC or attribute-based access control, although we do mention that at different parts of the presentation. We certainly have a lot of the base content on that topic that you can find on our YouTube channel or on our website. But for today, we're going to focus on the General Data Protection Regulation and the changes to it. So I'm going to hand over to Måns to give us a basis foundation for what GDPR is all about. Then we'll bring in Atul for some commentary, and then Måns will continue with some different approaches of how to deal with this requirement. So Måns, I will turn the stage over to you.
Thank you, Gerry. Can you hear me okay?
Can hear you loud and clear.
Perfect. So good evening from Amsterdam and good morning to colleagues and attendees from the US. So I am here to briefly give you a little bit update to start this webinar with on the EU General Data Protection Regulation. It will be a quick overview, and I have just two small disclaimers before we start this. And the thing is that neither of the staff working at Axiomatics are really experts in GDPR. We are not lawyers either. So while presenting the sort of the baseline of the GDPR concept and the framework, so handle this information with care. One of the benefits, however, of this is that the overview will be rather quick and fast. So I hope you can see the first slide now, which is the overview of the General Data Protection Regulation. So it is a common law for all member states in the European Union, and the main purpose of it is to strengthen and unify the data protection requirements for individuals. Of course, it has also a plan to sort of level the competitive rules for organizations also working in the state, but mainly it's about strengthen and unify the data protection of individual data. So the main purpose is then to reduce any barrier for also organizations to compete with each other, and this general protection regulation is actually going to be effective the 25th of May this year. So it's more or less 6 months to prepare in order for the regulation to take place. And neither of the member states needs to in any way take decisions, because it's a regulation, meaning that it is a law. So all states will immediately take this law in effect by May 25th. And in the law, there are three main sort of parties. And it's the party of the data subjects, which are the individuals, and the employees, customers, or partners of an organization. Then there is the data controller to the right here in the slide. And the data controller is the one who owns the relationship with the data subject. The third party is the data processor, and that might be an IT organization that processes data. That can be an in-source or an outsourced data processor. And these are the three main actors, so to say, in this relationship. There are several rights and responsibilities that needs to be carefully evaluated between the data subject and the data controller. There can be consent, or there can be contracts stipulating what you can and cannot do with data. Between the data controller and the data processor, there should be agreements in place. So obviously these are legal documents that needs to be in place for any type of operation if somebody is processing data for a data controller. It applies, the law applies to anybody who are sort of based in the European EU now. So it doesn't really matter if the data subjects are outside of the EU, if the data processor is inside EU. And that goes also for the data controllers and the data subjects. That means that many of organizations outside of the EU actually need to apply to this and for many reasons need to comply with these regulations. There are some highlights, and most of this information comes from Wikipedia. As I said, all of it comes from Wikipedia. The first highlight, of course, is the control of PII data. That is personally identifiable information. And if you handle this type of data, you need to do so in a lawful, fair, and transparent way. It is also important that all management and processing of data is actually specific, explicit, and used with a legitimate use. And that was some wording wrong. You have to have clear rules in place for capturing of data and retaining data. So that means that you need to understand why you are doing it, why you are collecting data, whose data you are collecting, what that data is, when you collect it, and where you store and process it. So obviously these are also strict data protection requirements on top of that data. You need to appoint a data protection officer, and that officer should and could be independent from the organization. That data protection officer needs to conduct the data protection impact assessment, and that is likely a yearly matter, so you need to do that many times. You need to have processes in place if you get breached and somewhat this personal data gets lost or stolen. You need to notify the local supervising organization of each country, but you also need to notify the data subjects, the customers, the employees for that matter. As discussed earlier to the right, there is a need to at least collect consent from users so that they consent to the use and processing of your data. There are also several rights of the data subjects that are really, really important. And that is that all users, employees, or customers have the right to access their personal data. They have to have the right to restrict the use of that data, to rectify that data, and also the possibility to be erased. That is also known as the right to be forgotten, which means that you actually need to take away most of the data and allow the end user to not be associated with you as an organization. There is also possibility of the data portability so that the end user or the customer can actually request to get data transferred from your site until so he can personally move that to another supplier if he wants. There is the notion of privacy by design and by default, meaning that security and privacy controls needs to be in place when you buy and build systems. And this is a massive thing for the IT industry, I think. There are also penalties up to 4% of the turnover, which is a massive amount of money for many organizations. So that is likely one of the major reasons that the interest is so high, and also in an organization that are not regulated prior now or really looking into, so what can we do in order to comply with this law? Each country has their own supervision organization, so they are also the one who collects the fines if those are needed. So that was mainly some highlights about the regulation. I've been asked to give some views also where customers are in the process, and to that I have reached out a little bit to friends of the family and also to customers, finding out what actually goes on in this business. And my view is that it now has passed the stage that fills seminars, okay? So there has been numerous events, seminars, other types of exhibitions, and those events have really been packed by people. So the last couple of years now, GDPR seminars actually fills the houses. But now it has shifted a little bit, so it is even now a dinner conversation as we go. Many of these discussions actually continue at nighttime, and that is not in any type of IT security or sort of legal matters. It's business people talking to each other about this issue because it's really on their agenda. So GDPR projects are highly prioritized at customers today. They are very visible and have large budgets. They are now more moving into a practical phase. They have been focusing very much on preparing and analyzing and understanding the legal requirements, but they are now working against fixing the process and the legal framework. So agreements and process needs to be in place. And this is pretty fine for organizations that are regulated today. An organization that is not regulated have larger problems with this, of course, meaning loyalty card memberships, organizations that have collected information but haven't, really been exposed to auditors and these types of legal requirements before. And one of the things that needs to be said also, that the law is not very explicit. So there are not many firm requirements or points to what you should do. So there is a lot of room for interpretation, and that's why you might need to talk and investigate time together with lawyers how the law actually affects you. There are also conflicting regulations, of course, because if you want to remove data, if somebody calls you up and say, I want to be forgotten, obviously that can be in conflict with, for instance, your audit requirements or your finance requirements, that you cannot remove all data. There are plenty of challenges at the moment, and also obviously setting the expectations and ambition level is hard today. And it's very hard for customers to define and understand what type of data they have and what type of data they should have. And that includes the rights of the data subjects. Which data should we actually expose to customers? What can they do with it? How can they restrict it? And obviously, this is the challenge, because they have so many systems that contains customer data, and the data quality perhaps is not that perfect, so it's easy to expose it. And obviously, the consent collection is also one of the challenges that people are facing at the moment. And lastly, also the ambition to outsource or even go for cloud computing, meaning that these are the data processor. This actually has big impacts and great concerns of these companies. Okay, so that was a little bit about the general data protection regulation as an introduction. So I plan to hand over to you, Gerry.
All right, thanks, Måns. And I just want to check, Atul, if you can hear us, okay?
Yeah, I can absolutely hear you, loud and clear.
Perfect. I think that's a great foundation that Måns has laid out for us here, and to me, that it feels like we have competing objectives here. Where on one hand, the drive to personalize and customize content is such a huge emphasis for sales and marketing organizations and within enterprises, but now we are squarely running up against privacy requirements such as GDPR. Can you share some of your thoughts on this, Atul, and where you see organizations going?
Yeah, absolutely. But first of all, thank you for having us here. And that was a great foundation which Måns has set up. We are, as EY, we are in the process of us dealing with a lot of customers who are trying to tackle GDPR. And also what we are seeing is, as you rightfully said, Gerry, is that companies are trying to do digital transformation. And as part of the digital transformation, customer experience enhancement is one of the core objectives. And in order to enhance the experience of the customers, the challenge with there is to personalize the offering, personalize the services. So now, in order to think about how we are going to personalize any services, the first and the foremost requirement is you need to have as much data as possible, not only about the individual, but about their behavior in terms of what they like, what they don't like, in terms of their transactions, of what they are buying or what they are trying to stay away from. So everything right from their behavioral pattern to transaction to every other details, which is a big part of PII, comes into play, and the companies are trying to have as much as possible, which gets into kind of a, for lack of a better word, I will use the word conflicting situation with what GDPR is saying, because primarily GDPR is talking about how do you minimize PII data. That's a big requirement, that how we are going to minimize all the PII footprint within the enterprise digital footprint. And also the other challenging fact there, apart from data minimization, is there is a notion of how you're going to anonymize the data, how you're going to pseudonymize the data. So think of this conflict where on one side with digital transformation, you want to have as much as data as possible about a person, customer or employee. And on the other side, there are very strict laws which are coming around privacy and consent management, which is trying to highly regulate and minimize it. So that's the conflict, what we are seeing in the industry. So there has to be a very practical approach which can bring the fine balance between the two. And that's why we thought this, calling it this as a practical approach of how you bring that balance between the personalization and the privacy requirement, from a corporate point of view, where they can be successful with their transformation objective, but at the same time, not risk themselves or expose themselves to the privacy laws which are coming. And what we are doing as a solution provider is we are coming up with those balances in terms of technology, processes, and also there is a third pillar to this, which is making the human force well-trained and all to know how to deal with this new privacy laws. So very much the balancing between these two areas is a technology problem, as well as there is an, companies need to do a lot of things around processes as well as people. So all the three dimensions which we generally talk about come into play, and that's exactly what we are trying to incorporate in order to bring this balance of personalization and privacy.
Right.
And in this discussion, we are going to go more and more about what are those technology pieces which we are putting into place.
Yeah, that's quite a delicate balance. And before we let Måns continue, I wanted to ask you one other question here related to process status that Måns was just talking about. And can you give some ideas or comments on what do you think is the general state of readiness for most organizations at this time where we're just 6 months away from the deadline for implementation?
Right. That's a great question. So a lot of companies, before I go into that detail, I agree with Måns. What he clearly stated is companies are prioritizing it. Definitely a lot of emphasis, a lot of priority is being put here. In terms of readiness, what we are seeing is from a technology readiness, some of the companies are going ahead and implementing technology control. At the same time, some of the other companies are saying that I'm going to field it through an outsource model, let's say, where if we get a request for data portability, we get a request for data right to erase, we are going to handle it manually with least of, technology enablers in place. The rift or the difference is because nobody knows at this point of time, come 25th May 2018, how many requests they are going to get, whether there will be millions of requests coming in for, let's say, right to erase or data portability, or it will be only few. So there are companies which are taking a very technological approach, revamping their technology footprint to be ready for that floodgate to open, and they get bombarded with millions of requests. And at the same time, on the other side, there are a lot of companies who are saying that we'll deal it with business process, kind of an outsourcing scenario with requests coming in, open the ticket, and people doing it manually. So everyone is taking it seriously. Companies are putting the deadline of March and April to be readiness so that they can do some kind of a testing and, dry runs before the May deadline. But pretty much, everyone is putting it as a high priority, either through process technology. And yes, of course, they are training their privacy team, their level 1 team to deal with all this requests which will be coming in from GDPR.
Interesting. Yeah. So taking a variety of approaches that, whatever is best suited for the individual organization. Excellent. Okay. Well, how about now, Måns, if we turn things back over to you, you want to talk about some of the, how dynamic authorization capabilities can help in supporting these GDPR initiatives and requirements. So we'll turn the floor back over to you for now.
Thank you. So, yes, I think it's a really important topic, actually, what we can do in order to help customers in their GDPR initiatives. As many of you are aware of, so Axiomatics is in the business of helping customers protecting their most sensitive information and data and transactions. And obviously, the whole discussion about privacy protection and data protection are just big aspects of that discussion. Meaning that we talk to the resources, we talk to the actual information that we need to share with different stakeholders. So obviously, that has been going on now for the last couple of years, and I will not do a lecturing in digital in this space, but what we have seen so far with new business models and new services coming out across the whole industry, this is actually the main reason for GDPR coming back to the question of how are customers going to deal with privacy around keeping the individuals safe. So obviously, the whole customer journey that Atul was talking about, and obviously that also goes for government agencies. It's just another different journey. It's more of the events of a life of citizens, meaning that we are protecting and collecting data, and we will continue to do so in order to actually keep up with the service levels that customers and citizens want from us. And obviously, this practical approach that we are talking about, this is really a concern with companies that that use digital and compliance working against each other. And obviously, they need to put their best brains in both these sort of driving forces and put them together in one room and actually deal with things like privacy by design, security by design and default and all that. So, and if we take the business side out of things and we just focus a little bit about the more technology aspects of where we are today. So the IT sort of buzzword bingos that we can have around containers, microservices, cloud computing, blockchain, and what have you. These technologies has also been so evolving the last couple of 5 years, and obviously these are very well suited to help organizations to get into this what Gartner released a couple of years back called bimodal IT or pace layering architectures, meaning that you need to be able to go both fast and slow in your IT approach. And obviously that has now taken so much sort of effect into many IT organizations that they are now seriously deploying and implementing a DevOps approach to how they operate IT. And I think that is the really fundamental thing that is really applicable also to security, meaning like DevOps, meaning full automation, meaning if any type of service is faulty and non-conforming, then you should just take it out, kill it, and just replace it with a new container or a new version. But you do not, you don't go through a long cycle. You can even skip production. Skip the testing, go to production, and try it out because you have already fixed the template and you have already, tested the actual service before. And this is really applicable to how we're going to deal with security also now, because security cannot be like also a very sort of static configuration, hard-coded files or roles, or always be built upon an approval step. So instead of that, we need to have policies that run security. And obviously, if you are a security architect and working alongside with, and you have been doing so for quite some time, so we have been doing work around confidentiality, integrity, least privilege, and need to know, and all that, network security. These are the focus of yesterday. Not saying that any of this is bad or outdated, and I especially like the need to know, but because that is what we're going to come back to when I start to get more specific around GDPR. Because when those new services and those users and those data, gets collected, and you have more threats than ever and more regulations than ever. So what we do with enterprise architecture and enterprise securities now is more preparing ourselves for information sharing, meaning that would be both internal inside organization and external between organizations to enable new business, deal with operational risk, and also, of course, protection. And when I was reaching out to one of the friends of mine, I was speaking to him in his role as the CFO for a Nordic bank. And he was saying that he was not that concerned about the actual fines, but he was really concerned about brand protection. Of course, customer and privacy protection, but that in the end, if they don't do that well, the brand sort of, the damage to the brand was higher than the fines actually. And I think that is a good way of thinking and not seeing the fines as the ultimate sort of threat to us. In this slide, I've also outlined a couple of technologies, and these are only a fragment of the ones that are important. So enterprise security deals with a lot of things, but here are a couple of them that I find useful, and some of them are here to help with data protection. I'm thinking of data loss prevention. To the bottom, to the right, I can see data tokenization and encryption technologies. And encryption technologies and pseudonymization is actually, I think it's the only thing that is mentioned in the law text as good examples that you can use It's not stating that you should use it, but you can use it as examples. But here comes also mobile security, API security, and also very, very importantly, access management. And obviously, this is a place where Axiomatics fit rather nicely in. We work together alongside with other companies that also do access management to actually help us implement a better control of who can access what. And the access management part of these technologies fit rather nicely into API security also, which are mainly the foundation of how customers today are deploying digital initiatives. So by applying API security together with access management, I think we can come quite far in this work. So for those of you who don't know, have too much background in Axiomatics and with what we do, so I'm just going to go a couple of seconds on what we do. We say we are specializing in access control and authorization management, and what is that? You know, to the simplest way of explaining this is somebody is asking for access, and then there is a decision for either permitting or denying that access. Obviously, what's the issue with that then? So, is there a problem today? And yes, I think there is a problem today, and the problem is that authorization is very often tightly coupled with an application and the data it consumes. So obviously, if we have a multiple set of applications, which we don't have 10, we don't have 15, large organizations have thousands of applications. And if authorization is not a visible business practice or a visible IT security practice, then of course you have a very fragmented approach to it. We don't have control, and it's actually hard to achieve compliance, and it's hard to do digital transformation as well. The concept that we have, and this is more or less the only slide we have on dynamic authorization, meaning that in this presentation, meaning that we have a way to externalize and centralize authorization out from applications. The concept of an enforcement point, a central authorization engine that consumes policies, and those policies stipulate which attributes that are affected by this request. And the attributes, of course, can come from a various amount of sources, meaning the users, meaning the applications, but it can also come from a lot of other sources. And in a GDPR context, these sources of attributes that we can utilize when we are dynamically assigning authorized or permissions are, of course, contracts. There might be power of attorneys, meaning stipulating what me and my wife, how we can share, for instance, bank accounts, or we can share information between a father and a son dealing with medications. We can have delegation models that is useful to define who should actually be able to touch various types of documents. It can be contracts that I want to share in an insurance portal. For instance, my wife could be easily access those information if I could delegate to her. The consent that the companies, that the data controller needs to provide me with so I can fill out my detailed consent. It can be risk levels. It can be about protected identities. And it can also be lists, right, about forgotten customers, the country of the customer and the country of the employee, and also the information about the employee. These are the attribute sources that we make use of. And we don't have a specific GDPR solution, but we definitely have specific GDPR context, meaning reaching out to these type of systems in order to make the correct access control decision at runtime. So where does this apply? It applies to a variety of IT, as I say, tiers or infrastructure components. I have outlined a little picture here that illustrates sort of a complete infrastructure. I know that it is very sort of a simplified way and it doesn't deal with all kinds of deployment models. But anyhow, we can see from the left to the right, users or things accessing or sending information through either API gateways or web proxies. It hits integration layers, it touches applications, it stores data in application databases, and those can in the end be moved to a more historical database where BI users are reviewing the information. Okay, so we have 3 authorizations engines that all consume the same set of policies. We have one administration point, and here is where authorization administrators and policy authors compile and define authorization. The concept of having multiple policy enforcement points, and we don't need to go into details about this, but you can have one or several of these, and they can talk to the central service. Obviously, data protection is really important, so obviously we need to be able to filter the central data services that we have, so we enforce them through policy enforcement points that talks to the more SQL traffic between the applications and the databases. These PEPs talks to the Axiomatics data access filter, and we also have some for big data on Hadoop. The policy information points that is retrieved and coming back to sort of the real value of having a GDPR sort of discussion around this is obviously which are the actual attribute sources, and how does the business interact with those attribute sources. These are more or less sort of an outline of an architecture, but I will now move more into what specific GDPR requirements that we can sort of provide support for. So are we still on track on time, Gerry? Right.
Yeah, oh yeah, Måns, we're fine time-wise, so carry on. It's excellent.
Okay.
Excellent material.
Okay, so more specifically around the topic of how can we support GDPR initiatives. And obviously the main thing here is that we have a possibility to create that central IT security practice, but also a business practice. We have a chance to consolidate and externalize from application authorization into one single place. So obviously that has value if you are deploying services to multiple communities. You can build trust, balancing privacy and risk, having the different types of attribute sources coming in place, the contents, the policy, the powers of attorney, of course, and meaning that this central service is actually a really, really interesting GDPR sort of point for enforcing and getting sort of control of authorizations in an organization. I see 4 very interesting and perhaps broad but still valid points where we actually can help. The first one is around data protection, and that is a very broad term. To the right, we see some of the legal text, and it doesn't get more detailed than this. So I will not spend time on reading that, but at the far end in bold and underlined, and I haven't done that, that is part of the legal text, is to ensure a level of security appropriate to the risk. This is sort of the language that EU stipulates in order to be compliant with regards to data protection. And here is the fact that when you have applied all your data retention policies, when you have thrown away all data that you don't want to keep, then it's really useful to have a tool that can logically minimize who can access that. And that comes back to the need to know principle, meaning that only the persons who actually should have access can have access. One example could be if some customer calls you up and say he wants to be forgotten. Okay, that might be a little bit of an attribute that we take. We don't need to deal much with it more, but since that is a process of removing that from that user identity from several systems, might be hundreds of systems, might take weeks or months to do. But with that little attribute that says this customer has asked to be forgotten, then only a specific set of users internally in the organization can actually work on that process. And that is just one way of minimizing it. Of course, the other thing is only to provide information to the right person, the normal access control capabilities that we have. Data pseudonymization and data access and data sharings as well. These are the normal ways we deal with data pseudonymization. We can use that when we have filtering and masking of SQL data. Data access, when somebody should access, we can always take into the context around that user, so no access is granted unless the right context is applied. Data sharing and data control means that we have the possibility also now to construct policies that enables information and APIs to either open or close in order to facilitate data sharing across organizations, inside or outside organizations. The notion of user consent and what a consent is, but I guess we all will be exposed quite shortly with emails dragging us into various types of sites where we need to update profile information, preference data information, but now also privacy and consent information. So obviously this is a process, and we are not in the process of providing the user interface nor the storage of these consents, but obviously when a consent should be enforced in an organization, we are there to consume those consent attributes in order to facilitate an access control process after the consent is given or taken back. Let me highlight that there are a couple of interesting IT technology standards here in this space. OAuth and user managed access are driving these things, I think, in most ways, but also the use of XACML. And I think that together, these three types of technologies really can make up a really strong consent and delegation model to enable data sharing based on consent. This is something that we should enter into discussions with, so I encourage anybody to come back with us and talk about how these technologies can work together. The XACML approach in this case is very focused on allowing data controllers and data processors with the possibility to actually consume consent in order to ensure that the user's willings are enforced across the organization. Another important aspect of the GDPR is that each controller needs to have a record of every processing activity that takes place. And with this central authorization engine comes a really, really important audit trail. So the audit logs coming out of the central authorization engine gives us insight to actually who requested what was requested, what was the context around the user, what was the context around the resources, and which attributes was actually made up to the decision of granting or denying that user. So the audit logs is sort of a benefit or an extra gain from centralizing authorization. We also get a central and very important audit logs that is really useful for either providing end users with the notion of who has touched my accounts, or auditors who want to look into sort of who has touched certain accounts over a specific time frame. And the last item I have is also the concept of privacy by design and privacy by default. And again, I'm not going to read through all the text, but as it applies to all, if you are buying products, so then you're going to hassle your vendors about, so is this CRM system, for instance, applying the principle of privacy by design and privacy by default? But it also applies to if you are building applications. And obviously, if you are building applications, then you need to take in considerations the security and how it is applied. So I'm coming back to the slide I had earlier. that architecting privacy by design and privacy by design is not something you can do as an afterthought. You need to use various technologies in order to achieve this. I do believe that Axiomatics has one of the capabilities actually to build out privacy by design, security by default, security by design, by implementing this central authorization framework. So obviously that is one piece of the puzzle, and that more or less concludes the findings I have around this. I will not go through the summary in the sake of time, but I think it's obvious that these 4 slides more or less summarize the intention of my little presentation here. So with that, I am ready to hand over to you, Gerry.
Okay, Måns, awesome. Thank you very much for presenting that content. I want to bring Atul back into the conversation here and ask you, Atul, from the EY perspective, what are some of the practical concepts and recommendations that you're making to clients these days on how to deal with GDPR based on what Måns has shared with us so far?
Absolutely, sure, Gerry, and Måns, great presentation. So from our point of view, what we are suggesting is around the technology space is 4 different pillars. So in order to tackle some of the data subject right articles, which we have already discussed, number 1 issue is, or the pillar is to define what is PII. So in your corporate data footprint, we have to clearly articulate and identify what are the PII data attributes related to customer, employee, and where exactly they live. So in terms of discovery of those PII data, both in the structured and unstructured format, which is there. So that is number 1, that you have to know exactly the footprint of PII, and you have to be very, very clear that what is the exact definition of PII in your enterprise context, and not only which is residing with you, but also with the controller, which can be your outsourced service provider, and so on. Step number 2, or the pillar number 2, is the identity unification. The challenge which most of the enterprises are facing is that they don't have the same exact definition of the customer across their digital footprint, which can be on-premise, cloud, and so on. So what you have to do is you have to unify the identity, whether it is employee or customer, so that there is always one and only one notion of the identity across the footprint. The third piece is the entire identity lifecycle management, where any identity lifecycle event, whether a customer registering or subscribing for your services to the point where they are, enrolling themselves for services and other such offering, to, in an employee context, someone joining your enterprise as an employee, getting transferred from one department to another. So the entire customer journey map or employee lifecycle management has to be well thought through, and you have to connect all the dots so that the entire lifecycle can be managed properly. Otherwise, supporting some of the articles, such as where you are putting the restriction on processing, will become a challenge. I just want to revisit my earlier point on identity unification. Identity unification becomes a very important requirement to support articles like data portability. So at any point of time, if a customer or employee is coming and requesting to port all the data, if you have unified the identities across the board, data portability becomes an easy thing. So similarly, on identity lifecycle management, whether you're thinking about restricting the processing or someone putting a hold on to the processing, those kind of articles can be easily met if you have a right lifecycle. Even right to erase, which is such an important one, is nothing but, if you really want to decompose it, you can think of it as deprovisioning of data from all the respective system, whether connected or not connected. So if you have a proper lifecycle management system, you should be able to deprovision the data. And of course, there are exceptions, like in your financial system, you cannot remove them because of the financial restrictions. So to Måns' point earlier, you might think of anonymizing that data, pseudonymizing the data, so you're not losing the data, but at the same time, PII footprint is definitely not is getting addressed. And the fourth pillar is the access management, which was very well covered by Måns. We have seen in practical world tools like Axiomatics making a huge difference, especially when GDPR says that with consent management, with right to stop processing, or those kind of articles where you need a externalized and centralized entitlement, a product like Axiomatics would definitely make a difference for you, because you can implement this rule set based on someone's consent across your omni-channel footprint. So no matter whether the request is coming from a web channel or a mobile channel or an IVR and so on, no matter which particular omni-channel, you will be able to enforce it because you have centralized it and externalized it. So those are the four key pillars with which we are trying to address articles from data subject right and some of the other GDPR articles. With that, back to you, Gerry.
Yeah, that's great, Atul. I mean, having that kind of structure around the process is so important. I know that's part of the big value that EY provides its clients. I want to ask you one other question before we open it up and bring Måns back in, and just to remind our attendees that you can put a question in the GoToWebinar question box. If we don't have time, we'll definitely get back to you by email. So Atul, earlier Måns was describing the motivation of some people that he's talked to, where some people were saying it was about brand protection of the company. They didn't want to have a GDPR violation that would impact the brand's reputation, versus a motivation to avoid penalties or fines. Are you seeing people lined up in those two buckets, or other attitudes toward what is the real motivation for people to prepare for GDPR?
Oh yeah, I mean, so the attitude, the positive attitude, which I definitely appreciating in the industry is, some of the companies are saying that, okay, GDPR is telling me to do all these good things about someone's privacy for European Union. Why not to do it for the Americans and other citizens too, which we have? So companies are taking this leap over and beyond and saying that we should have privacy by design approach, not only what is being enforced by GDPR, why don't we extend it to other people and all? And I think with the breaches which are happening, all the compromise which are happening, I think companies have an intention now to go over and beyond, take more of a risk approach than just trying to be compliant. And this was there with a lot of corporate data in place from an IP point of view, but now we are seeing the same thing getting into privacy and some of the other areas where the companies are not just limiting themselves to being compliant, rather they are saying that we have to go over and beyond, because this is a great opportunity to build our goodwill in the industry, and people will appreciate the fact that their data is being taken seriously from a privacy, from a security point of view. So yes, a lot of companies are taking it in a very positive way and trying to go over and beyond than just being compliant.
Well, that certainly would be a great development, excuse me, to see that come to fruition. So let's tackle one of these questions here. And one of our listeners points out that we really didn't touch on data residency issues here. I think maybe that was implied, but Måns, can I start with you? Can you discuss any requirements or issues around where data resides as it relates to GDPR?
Yeah, I was thinking of that when I saw that we need to track, for instance, the customer country, sort of in which country the actual customer is based, and also where the staff that is sort of processing the data, where they are based. So we are focusing our efforts around, okay, if you have central data or distributed data, how can we apply policies to make sure that no other than the correct users can view this data? I mean, what goes on now in many ways where Brexit will happen in a couple of years, we need to be able to sort out that no other people than UK-based or English or UK-based staff actually can view the English data and not the other way around. So obviously the actual question about, okay, how should one think and where should we have data residing, I am not really the expert to do, but obviously the attribute-based access controls can help in at least making sure that on a need-to-know basis, only the right person get to that data.
Right, because we can take that information into account. Now, Atul, this also has implications for safe harbor, which basically is superseded, right, with GDPR kinds of requirements. So are you seeing that being another challenge to deal with the data residency, where safe harbor might have been acceptable in some days past, but not so much anymore?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, with safe harbor taking a backseat, data residency is becoming a hot topic. And also, what is playing a big role is the SaaS services, where companies are using third-party provider, where a lot of data is getting into the cloud, and especially now with platform as a services coming into play, where companies are putting the strategy of cloud first. So data residency has become a very hot topic. But when we think about it from a technology solution point of view, we think of data at rest. But at the same time, what we also think about is data in motion, data in use. You have to think about the other two factors too, and make sure that the applicable laws are very well addressed in your technology solution. I won't comment on the legal side of things because, of course, like as Måns said, I mean, we are not lawyers, but from a technology point of view, you should look into all those three dimensions, which is at rest, in motion, and in use, and make sure that the footprint is well thought through, no matter whether it is cloud, on-premise, or in a hybrid mode.
Very good. Well, I see we've reached the top of the hour. Atul and Måns, thank you so much for your perspectives on GDPR, especially bringing the the US and the EU conversation here together. I think it's been very valuable to have both of your points of view expressed. Thank you to the audience for attending very much. We appreciate your time. And as I said earlier in the webinar, we look forward to seeing you at one of the events coming up this month, especially if you're at the Gartner Identity Conference in Las Vegas at the end of November. So thank you again, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Atul and Måns, for presenting the content today. And we look forward to seeing you all again very soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.